Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tosfos Dibra Maschel Heicha de'ika chefufei chulu. Let's begin. Heicha de'ika chefufei chulu. Here in the Gemara, we presented the opinion of Acha Berei Ravika, who said that we only find that Rabbi Eliezer says Tzidei Rishus Harabim Rishus Harabim, that the sides of the Rishus Harabim are like the Rishus Harabim, is Heicha de'leka chefufei. If there are no barriers between the Tzidei Rishus Harabim and the Rishus Harabim, because then the public easily overflow into the Tzidei Rishus Harabim. However, Heicha de'ika chefufei, when there are barriers, we don't find that Rabbi Eliezer holds that even then it's the Rishus Harabim, and in that case, that's a case where it's going to be considered a karmelis. So Tosfos is going to present a question on this opinion, on this teaching of Rav Acha Berei Ravika, that when there are barriers, Rabbi Eliezer will say Tzidei Rishus Harabim lavke Rishus Harabim. It's not considered Rishus Harabim since there are barriers separating it from the Rishus Harabim, and then it will be a karmelis. So let's see the question that Tosfos presents. V'tema, it's a wonder, and now Tosfos, we're going to present in purple the source of the question, and this is going to be pointing up to the question and leading into the question itself. But Perikol Gagas, and Perikol Gagas, it's a perik in Masechtas Eruvin. Parach the Gemara asks, "V'lifleg b'tzidei Rishus Harabim da'alma." Let them argue in a tzidei Rishus Harabim in general, a typical tzidei Rishus Harabim. Pirush, meaning the question the Gemara is saying, "V'amai pligi b'chasash nifratza." Why do they argue about a yard that was breached? The machlekes between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer is if the wall of a yard collapsed. In that case, what is the area of that collapsed wall considered? The Rabbanan say that's considered a Tzidei Rishus Harabim, and Tzidei Rishus Harabim is Lavka Rishus Harabim. It's not a Rishus Harabim. That area is not part of the Rishus Harabim since it's not where the public walk. And Rabbi Eliezer says it is a Rishus Harabim because Tzidei Rishus Harabim ki Rishus Harabim. The sides of the Rishus Harabim are Rishus Harabim since the public overflow into it. So the Gemara asks, why do they argue about one individual non-typical case of a wall that collapsed? Why don't they argue about the general Tzidei Rishus Harabim? There was always a space between the Rishus Hayachid and the Rishus Harabim. That area is considered a Tzidei Rishus Harabim. The Gemara answers, or Mashani, the Gemara answers, that I have a pligi ba'alma. If they would argue in general about the regular Tzidei Rishus Harabim, Hava Amina, I would say, Ki pligi Rabbanon alei. When do the Rabbanon argue on Rabbi Eliezer? Hani mili, this is so heicha de ika chefufe, where there are barriers. If they were to argue about a regular Tzidei Rishus Harabim, we would say that the argument is limited when there are barriers. When there are barriers separating the Tzidei Rishus Harabim from the Rishus Harabim, then Rabbi Eliezer says it's a Rishus Harabim, and the Rabbanon will argue only over there and say, because there are barriers, it's not a Rishus Harabim. But if there are no barriers, we would say, then the Rabbanan agrees. Since there are no barriers separating the Tzidei Rishus Harabim from the Rishus Harabim, then it's considered a Rishus Harabim. Kamash Malona comes to teach us that this is not so. So we speak about a case where the wall collapsed, because over there are certainly no barriers, and this shows us that the Rabbanan hold that even when there are no barriers, still it's considered that it's not a Rishus Harabim. So that's the Gemara that Tosfos is quoting that leads into the question. Mashma, this seems to say the Rabbi Eliezer nami polig b'deika chefufe. The Rabbi Eliezer also argues, and there are barriers. If we read the Gemara, we'll show how it indicates the Rabbi Eliezer argues and says that it's a Rishus Harabim even when there are barriers. The Gemara said that if they were to argue in a regular Tzidei Rishus Harabim, we would make the mistake and say that they only argue where there are barriers. Kamash one, it comes to teach us that they don't only argue in that case, but they also argue when there are no barriers. So this indicates that they argue in both cases. We don't want to make the mistake and think they only argue when there are barriers, because the correct way of looking at it is that they don't only argue there, but they also argue when there are not barriers. So we see that they argue in all cases. In both cases, whether there are no barriers, whether they are barriers, Rabbi Eliezer will hold Tzidei Rishus Harabim, ki Rishus Harabim. So Tosfos presents two answers. V'yesh lemer, we could say the first answer is the hachi ka'amar. This is what the Gemara is saying. Kamash malon, it comes to teach us that where there are no barriers, dafka specifically over there, pligi, they argue. In other words, the simple way to learn the Gemara, and the way we read it previously is, we would make a mistake and think that they only argue when there are barriers. Kamash one, that they argue also when there are no barriers. Now we're reading it differently. We're saying we would think that they argue when there are barriers. That's the only place that they argue. Kamash one, that they don't argue over there at all, but rather they only argue when there is no barrier. Because if there isn't a barrier, there will be no machlekes, because since there are barriers, even Rabbi Eliezer will hold that it's not considered a Rishus Harabim. But where there are barriers, Rabbi Eliezer will agree. So we're reading the Gemara differently than the simple way of reading it. We're reading it that they're not arguing where there are barriers, they're only arguing where there are no barriers. Inami, or also another answer Tosfos says we could give, or also we can say, he's Sugya, that Sugya in Eruvin, Rav Papa da Hocha, follows like Rav Papa over here, the Lei Mechalak that doesn't distinguish. That Gemara really doesn't fit with Rav Acha Bereid Rav Aviko. It follows the opinion of Rav Papa, because Rav Papa holds, like we quoted his question in the Gemara, Rav Papa said that we don't find a case for Rabbi Eliezer where a person carries from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah through a Carmelis and he's chayiv, because according to Rabbi Eliezer, that Siddur Rosh Hashanah is a Rosh Hashanah. Rav Papa holds that Rabbi Eliezer always will say, in all cases, whether there are no barriers or whether there are barriers, in both of those cases he holds that Siddur Rosh Hashanah ki Rosh Hashanah. And Rav Acha Bereid Rav Aviko argued and said that we only find that Rabbi Eliezer will say this when there are no barriers. However, if there are barriers that separate it, then it will not be considered Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara in Eruvin, we can explain, does not follow Rav Acha Bereid Rav Aviko, it only follows the opinion of Rav Papa.